When I look back at the journey I have taken thus far on the spiritual path, one thing I recognize is the importance of the practice. Of course, this is obvious. Knowledge by itself doesn't mean you're doing it, except when I reflect back. After a certain awakening experience, I felt I got something, and therefore I researched and confirmed what I found and what I felt about the spiritual path can be proven. But still, the proving process itself may have to be resonating in terms of the practice, not just at the knowledge level to say I understand what they're talking about, but how I practice. And without that, and without your own self-awareness of what's going on, the knowledge by itself doesn't mean almost anything. You may look like you can talk and you can write a book or talk into the voice memo posting, but my intuitive sense I had early on makes sense. When I start to look into Zen and into Daisetsu Suzuki, interestingly, the words that he left was not so much of the importance in my view, although I felt something attractive the way he explained or expressed. But one book I read maybe 100 times or more is not a thick book, but a person named Shimura writing about Daisetsu and his encounter. As much as Plato to Socrates or Ejo to Dogen, there are people who are around the master and they capture the essence of the teaching. Often the master does not leave much so that the people has to write it down. So whatever is left is the document of some kind. It could be a sutra and lots of imagination in it. It's very interesting to look into it, but by itself, unless we get something and practice it in action in daily life, to me it doesn't mean much, or if I can say, it means nothing. So the Zen is pragmatic, and there's one phrase, Furyu Monji in Japanese. It means don't have the words stand on its own, meaning don't rely on the words, on the knowledge. And if you look into Tao Te Ching, there's a phrase early, maybe the first chapter, it says something like to those who know Tao, or the way, doesn't talk, and who talks, they don't get it. So those just two examples of the words left exemplifies the importance of not rely on the words, the logic, understanding. So it goes back to the saying of the left brain or the human way, that we have this faculty of using the language, the logic, cause and effect, good and bad, dualistic way, therefore we do this or that. That is still in one dimension in the mind. And unless that is captured, let's call it on the right brain, where there's a existential memory is captured in the image, so to speak. And that's the earlier stage of our development from the dust of the universe to come to life and lived in the Garden of Eden, here and now, without knowledge. But as soon as we ate the fruit of knowledge, to know beautiful or shameful or ugly or good or bad, any of that, we start to get lost in the mind. The mind is a tricky thing. It's a tool, but if we don't use the tool well, it's like a two-edged sword, we hurt ourselves. If we use well, we can live longer and happier, perhaps. But history has proven that even though we may have secured from certain level of the food shortage or the poverty, the issue in the mind is still troublesome. And to go over, we have to have a good wisdom to pass through that gate. And that, to me, is the spiritual path. And therefore, in that process, we have to understand the use of the brain, the mind, connected to what I said on the right brain, where we came from, or the experiential wisdom may be there, so that there's a connection as to how we can navigate our life. If you go back and look at the Buddha's way, perhaps it may be the same for Christ. What Buddha did is known in Japan as taiki seppo, which means on occasion, depending upon the situation, his sermon or the guidance is different. And that, to me, is very profound. The meaning of that is that the mind and the brain, how it functions, varies so much depending upon how you are brought up and even before that. So, because of the habitual pattern programmed or implanted even in our brain may pop up, and it may come up in a suddenly different manner for each person. So the teaching of Buddha may be seen as knowing where it came from for that specific instance, for that specific person. He gave the guidance. Maybe that's what, at least theoretically, all the counselors should do. I'm sure they may have certain skill to do that, but the Buddha is known to be perhaps the world famous first psychologist or the spiritual teacher, or one of them at least. So it all points that practice in whatever we've got in everyday life, because the environment changes and we change ourselves, we have to be on top of it. Easy to say, difficult to do, but this is just to point out the importance of the practice. I think it was Dogen who said it's a lifelong training. But at the same time, he also said training and awakening is the same point. That if it's practiced with this principle way, the way of what Buddha teaches, or according to the laws of universe, as I call it. And when you are on that path, practicing the principle, I said there's less or no blockage within yourself that you sense, which may be difficult unless you have experience of it, but to come with that clarity within ourselves. Since the blockage is gone, you feel transparent, and energy is coming out naturally to the point that even the brain activity is reflecting that energy or the way of universe prevailing. One story connected to that point I remember what Eckhart Tolle was talking about is that having that awakening experience, it took 8 years to start to be within the society to function, because instead of using the brain right after, he has to kind of settle and cultivate so that the energy flowing is not deviated, going to the wrong direction, but manifesting according to the laws. In case of Joshu, who is a well-known Zen master, he had awakening, and the example is in the koan. Ordinary mind is the way. That was my first koan too. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you find that state of being, it is like the whole sky is open, and there was no right or wrong, good or bad. something of that nature. And when Joshua heard that from Nanzen, Zen master at the time, he got enlightened, but he says it took 30 more years to put that idea in practice, so that the momentarily awakening is not to indicate, it's just a momentary thing. And you may feel this profound awakening sense in the what I call waku waku, the vibration and the transparency you feel inside of you, but you get clouded if you're not careful. And for that, I practiced 10 years of more vipassana, and still not enough. So like Dogen says, it's a continuous practice, continuous training, continuous awakening. So my term is middle way, like a pendulum going in and out, in and out. And therefore, this path continues, hopefully. And you may find that you may be on track because things start to speak on its own, as evidenced by what I call the 4 types of wisdom, or 5 types, depending upon what books you may read. And those are the way to check. And the checking mechanism is so important, like a PDCA starting with check. Always check to see what's going on, right and wrong, why, and what can be done, and then develop the way, find the way to move forward and practice it, and check again if you are on the right track. As much as the Sila Samadhi Panya, at the same point, you try to do this right conduct, then every now and then you check in the state of samadhi, calm and quiet mind, to see if everything is flowing, the energy level and all of that. And then out of that may come the wisdom, the panya, and therefore you realize you're back on track. So such is just a brief comment about the point of you can call it the paradox. Knowing is not the same as doing. It's not the paradox. It's kind of obvious, but all the saying of the spiritual teachers and so forth are often seen as paradoxical, like a Furumonji I talked about. Don't put the words stand on its own and think that's the answer. And that was one of them I mentioned. And those who talk may not know. That's also very true. Just looking at myself in the mirror. And that's why I'm talking about many things on the YouTube, not just to check my English, and if I'm speaking intelligently, which may not be the case, but I try, not just doing that, but at the same time, to make sure that I'm on track the best I can. So this is a continuous process, and as I expected early in my life, this passage is very interesting, but as Daisetsu said at one point, walking on the path of Buddha, or the spiritual path, it's like going through the thorny bushes, lots of traps all around. So be careful, be humble, be sincere and truthful. I believe such may be the very important attitude, and keep having this idea of if there's a will, there's a way. It's proven. It has to be proven. And that's what I suggest we should do. Hopefully helping and encouraging with each other in this passage I call the New Hero's Journey. Thank you.